Hey Matt, thank you very much for joining me on my podcast, Product Tea with Leah, where we spill the tea on product and some adjacent topics. If you want, you can just introduce yourself real quick to the audience right away, and then we take it from there.
Hi, Leah. I forgot to brew my tea before we started, but maybe we can have a second half and I can do that in between. Um, Hi, everybody. My name is Matt Greenberg. I'm the CTO at a company called Reforge, which helps product managers and others in tech do the best work of their career with education for sort of mid-career professionals who want to do kind of like really advanced and complicated work, learning from experts in their field. I run product engineering, design, and data there. Also, at different points, have run marketing, HR, operations, and partners. So the whole gamut of what we do. Previous to that, I was a VP of engineering at Credit Karma, which is a US-based startup. Joined around 200 people, left around 1,500 people. Went from 100 million in revenue to a billion in revenue. So it was a good 5 years there, and done a couple other things in my time.
Amazing, and I usually round this off with an introduction from my side. What about you? One of the reasons that we are talking about, or like why I was interested also in inviting you to the talk, I got to know you or the stuff that you were also writing and co-writing through Reforge. So Reforge has been an absolutely invaluable resource for me as well, and for people that I teach about tech. To be honest, I was part of about 6 to 7 cohorts myself. It's really just an amazing resource, I think. By the way, I'm not sponsored in any way, right? So like I'm really saying this out of conviction.
You can be
And
if you want. We can talk about that.
yeah, we can talk about that, but like exactly. But I think interestingly, one of my highest performing content pieces was a recommendation of a piece that you co-wrote, which is how to treat tech debt. And I think I don't know whether you came up with the phrase itself, but now you can also you can just claim it because there's nobody else that is going to challenge it. But like treating tech debt as a debt where you get something from it, it is an investment is a very clever phrase, I think, and it's just overall a really clever concept. As many as I've learned also from Reforge in general, I would say.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things as an engineering leader where people freak out about tech debt all the time, and you see engineers try and act like they can stop it, and it's kind of just this like unstoppable force. So instead, when you run into those things, you want to figure out how to mentally think about it as leverage, and that leverage, I think, is really powerful. So yeah, I think tech debt absolutely is a strategic investment that you're making as a trade-off for other stuff at any given time. And really powerful people are doing that knowingly instead of sort of letting it happen to them.
No, and I think what's really interesting is that some friction that we get in our organizations, some of them you can treat this way, like tech debt, as you said. Some others, as growing your organization and just building it wrong, you can't. It just does not work that way. But I think we treated it for quite a long time the same. So for me, this was always like quite interesting. I had a lot of insights from Reforged that were going into this regard. Like I was always like thinking about something in a way, and then I saw a different thing because you have a lot of EIRs that are very competent, and also the articles are of quite high quality in that sense. One of my questions that I would have, one of my questions, if you don't mind, that I would have to Brian, but he refused so far to join me on this podcast, is that why are there no product-led growth courses on Reforge that are for free at the moment? Do you know anything? Because you just said the product is under you as well. So, like, why is Reforge not offering any of their courses for free? I know you have a free blog, but like that would be one of my questions to you now.
We'll see what happens next year.
Aha! Should I cut this out from the podcast, or can we keep it in? Okay, good.
Yeah, go for it.
All right. So,
I think people hiding their product roadmap in many ways is like a red herring. Like I get some companies want to be really secretive, and places like Apple, where they don't want anyone to talk about anything that they do inside the
yeah,
walls. I think for the most part, ideas are a dime a dozen, and it's all about execution. So, you know, you want to decide your path, and if a bunch of people want to copy that path, they have to do it better than you. And once you release it, they know about it anyway, so you don't really gain much by keeping that stuff. But it's definitely a thing that we think about and talk about at Reforge, and I hope we'll try and enable more and more of that next year.
Now, I think it's quite interesting because of one of the reasons that you mentioned where I also see resistance from people putting out roadmaps is the secrecy aspect, right? Like we don't want the competition to see what we're doing. It's total garbage. First of all, nobody's looking what you're doing anyways as a
Totally.
competition. One of the reasons why I'm not putting it out is that I don't want to commit myself to something that I might change because of a learning that we have in the next 2 months, right? But
Totally.
this is always super dangerous. Like, oh, but you promised this particular feature in like 6 months. It doesn't pan
Human
out that way.
perception is a difficult thing, and expectation management is probably like the hardest thing that we all run into,
Also in the organization, isn't it?
inside and outside. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so this is quite interesting. So what I did not know is that you have product and engineering under you as a CTO. Um,
Yep.
if I would have had to guess, then I mean I know that you don't have a CPO. I think Helen is the head of product. Is that
Yeah.
correct?
VP of product.
VP, excuse me. Sorry, Helen, if you're listening to this. So I think the last 10 years, in my experience, from a product leader's perspective, has been extremely changing in terms of how we develop products, but not only from a product's experience, but also like engineering. Cross-functional teams are almost like a table stake right now. Then we had SaaS as a business model. Now product-led growth, but nobody knows how to do it right. And then product-led sales and so forth. So maybe my question to you is now, is there anything that comes to your mind, because you've also been in leadership positions for over 10 years, is there anything that comes to your mind that strikes you as very special? Like, how did you experience this change? How was the Matt Greenberg 10 years ago in terms of responsibilities to what you see yourself as being responsible for?
It's an interesting question. I mean, the Matt Greenberg 10 years ago was kind of an idiot. Much smarter today. 10 years of learnings is a lot of learnings.
No.
I think that when I was at Credit Karma, I actually got introduced to the Reforge community. And some of the experts in the Reforge community used to have a dinner like once a quarter. And they were Elena Verna and Casey Winters and these like really super smart, sharp people at these name brand companies that I looked up to. And is it okay if I swear on your podcast?
It's totally fine. If you say
Yeah,
Elena, you can do anything afterwards as well because she's so awesome. She's
she
canceling
is
it
so
out.
awesome. And the reality is that like we would have dinner and they would all talk about how fucked up their companies were. And I loved those dinners because oftentimes it would be lonely. And, like I'd be at Credit Karma, which everyone else looks at and they'd be like, oh, wow, what a great company. They do all these things right, like really amazing. And all you see is like the fucked up stuff that happens inside your walls. And you're like, how do we ship anything or like come up with any good ideas? We're so dysfunctional. And the reality is like humans are dysfunctional. So like the more humans you put inside a building, the more fucked up it is. And so like all these companies are messed up. Like nobody does anything perfect. Everyone's shit stinks. And getting some comfort with that over time of just like, hey, it's okay, we didn't do that as well as we wanted to, and is, I think, just a really powerful thing that kind of like experience brings you. And you can just like keep wading into the deep end again and recognize that like, each time you want to do it a little bit better than last, you want to take a learning forward, you want to get like a little bit better and have that like growth mindset. Like we haven't done it perfect yet, but we probably never will. So there's like always opportunities to improve. And I think that once you get comfortable with that feeling that like you're not going to do it perfectly, it starts to unlock all sorts of capability for you. And 10 years ago, I would get so frustrated with every mistake, every problem, everything that didn't work out the way I wanted to. I got mad at myself, I got mad at others, and I really wanted to do it great. And I think now I realize I was doing it pretty darn well. And that drove me in a good way, but also in a really unhealthy way. And today I think I can just bring like a certain calmness to what I do, which really helps the ship move in the right direction over time.
Yeah, I think I can resonate with this in the sense that, I mean, I don't have 10 years of, higher leadership experience in that sense, but what I find quite interesting is that in the last 3 years also, you know, I started to learn that everybody's winging it. Everybody, from the C level to the investors, absolutely everybody. And it was funny because the other day we had a fail night where we were talking about things that we fucked up, and I presented a case that I completely messed up with Miro, um, all the way to the top, right? Like, so this was up to the CPO, just messed it up completely, and then one of the guests, which was a junior, was asking like, so yeah, but like, so how often does something go wrong? And I'm just like, daily. We have meltdowns daily. People trying to hack your stuff, data infrastructure just completely breaking down, broken toilets, that kind of stuff. But you get the idea. Like something is just constantly going wrong, or you have the human drama. Like there's just something is like absolutely dramatic, right? And I think, as you said, like it's very important to just keep calm and just not freak out, because if you accept that you're gonna mess it up anyways, then it's gonna be kind of fine. So
Yeah, I mean, I generally think of the world. If you imagine that there's like an axis of risk and reward, the the two by two that comes with that is sort of like you have low reward, high risk things. You should never do those. You have uh, high. You have low risk, high reward, low risk, low reward. You also should never really do. Like there's not a lot of value there. And then you have low risk, high reward things. And those are the things as a leader that you look to delegate. Like that's what my team is supposed to get done all the time. They don't need my help. They should just move. And my job is to take high risk, high reward things and sort of de-risk them so that they become low risk, low reward activities and my team can kind of execute on them. And as my team is going, oftentimes the risk profile changes because shit happens. And like as things move back up into the high risk, high reward camp, that's when like escalation is supposed to happen. And it's like a good, clean, healthy escalation that happens all the time. So like my job is basically not to deal with the happy path when things go right. That's what my team is for. And my job is to help on the risks and the blockers and the things that are messed up and get them like back on track again and move. So it's just like from week to week, you're just kind of hammering down risks and blockers all the time. That's all you do. So, if you think of like any plan as dynamic, it's dynamic up until you learn stuff and things happen and those risks and blockers happen and then you just deal with them. So like the more you move up in your career, the less you spend any time really working on like this worked real well. And like every meeting you have is about something that's broken, messed up, blocked, screwed up, not working right, whatever the case may be. And that's kind of like becomes more and more your job. So it's like hard to remember a day when you just like did a thing and the thing was done at the end of it and you moved on. Like those sorts of tasks just don't happen for me anymore.
yeah, that's fair enough. But I think don't you also start to enjoy it in some weird way where you're just like, I'm totally okay with this chaos and the responsibility? Because that's what it is for me now. I look at my calendar and I'm like, let's see what drama is happening today, but it's going to be good, I guess.
Yeah, I do think that what I would say is like you get motivation for things that you're good at and you want that feeling of like mastery and quality and like the impact you can have ends up really mattering too. So I think those things like make it worth it. But every once in a while I'll like spend the afternoon writing some SQL queries just because I know it's got a clear set of requirements and when I'm done and it's like taken care of and those tasks could be like a good break, rest for the
Yeah.
wicked, if you will.
I really like your summary though, like, or like the way that you phrased it with the risk and reward two by two. I always used to say that as product managers or as product leaders, we're risk managers. We're not scientists. We're not proving anything. So I guess it also applies to you as a CTO, right? Like, so you would say that. I mean, you call yourself a CTO, but I guess you're a CTPDO, right? So like,
I just do
and
what needs to get done. At this point, I'm just whatever needs doing, I'll do.
will you change your job description to CTPDO after this talk?
No.
Okay. Good. Okay. Just asking. It would have been awesome, by the way. All right. So, one of the questions that I had, because I don't know exactly, so or I could imagine that from your background, you're also someone that is very engineering focused. You're coming from this solution focused mindset. I guess when you came to Reforge, I think you already had a good idea on what to expect, but how was this in the end? Was there any clash, sort of like to work with this product focused for product people offering product? Was there something that where you said like this is not what I expected and I have to just like adapt now in any sense? Was there something about that?
I mean, I think it's interesting because there were many adaptations with that change. I managed like a 250 person team across multiple offices at Credit Karma, again, mostly engineering. And then I moved to a team that was like 15 people. And I was managing multiple functions. And I think there were like 3 or 4 engineers on it. So it's like a hugely different environment, right? Like what I'm doing every day changed an enormous amount. And I think at that point, like a huge chunk of really what I'm doing is like helping create alignment. So in most organizations, I actually think the hardest relationship is between product and design and engineering, right? Like most of the conflict happens when between product managers and engineering leaders who like want to do things in different ways. And the only person in the organization who's sort of like a common thread for them is the CEO. Those organizations often have like a lot of dysfunction. And it's just like hard to get stuff done. And one person wants to do it one way, one person wants to do it another way, and the CEO doesn't really want to get involved. So there's sort of always this like tension that gets created. And we'd like to imagine that like organizational lines don't have that much of an impact, but the fact that everything reported in to me meant we solved a lot of those problems pretty quickly. And a friend of mine always says alignment eats strategy for breakfast. And I think that's just super true, that getting those teams like aligned and beating the same drum and wanting the same things means that like for the most part, Reforge shipped better than any company I've ever worked at in a really meaningful way. And the collaboration between those teams is like definitely the easiest thing. The flip side of that is we are today still like a very content driven business. No one's going to Reforge to look at navigation and search and discovery, and you know, the product consumption experience matters, but for the most part, the value is in the content. So the people you meet, the events you go to, the EIRs, as you said. So that was also like kind of a new mental model for me of just like, I do own what is like traditionally the most powerful organization in a company, product and engineering, but it's not the most important asset, which meant that I always think of kind of that partnership within Reforge between the content and the people and the experiences that you have. That it's sort of like a dance partnership. And if you think of like Latin dance, everyone's there for the content and the people and the experiences. They're there for like the woman in the flowy red dress with the sequins and the sparkles. And then like the guy is there to pick them up and throw them and toss them and hold them in front of them. And like, that's the product's job, you know, but like the two things need to work in concert. Yep. So, you know, like being able to work in that mindset, I think was a thing that I adapted to pretty quickly, but like those were all like big changes between how things work and stuff that we've had to really learn as we've scaled the company.
How many employees do you have at the moment?
Just under 200.
Under 200, yeah, okay. Crunchbase is wrong again, because Crunchbase is referring something about 250 to 600.
That's yeah, lots and lots of people put Reforge on their LinkedIn profile.
Ah, okay. That is good to know. Ah, that's where they scraped this from. Okay, got it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so like, but Reforge is a Series B right now, right? So like, you're in a Series B, you have about 200 employees, you've grown a lot, and as you said, you moved more and more to an alignment position, right? Mm-hmm. In that sense.
Yeah.
What I find interesting, because my prevailing theory is that it's not that hard to align design and engineering and product. It's more like, how do you align in the future marketing and sales? Sales is less important for you, I guess, because most of your acquisition is probably I don't know, probably automatic inbound driven.
It's like
Uh,
a bottoms up SaaS company. Yeah.
yeah, and so the interesting bit, so for me, it's always like one of the questions is like, how do we integrate marketing into the entire mix? I think that's also a very fascinating question because one of the very interesting concepts that I also learned from Mark Roberish, former CRO of HubSpot, is that if you put marketing people under marketing and not under where the product is, then they are always limited to top of the funnel because you will not find engineers that want to work in marketing. Um,
It's an
because
interesting
you
problem.
go
Yeah.
ahead, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting problem. I think a lot of my learnings at Credit Karma were from taking some engineers and having them work with marketing. And that was sort of like how I met Elena in the first place, getting some advice on that and starting to think through it. And ultimately, it didn't come naturally at first to either side. But performance marketing in many ways is becoming more and more like algorithmic and programming. So a lot of the tools from, like iterable DMPs and DSPs and, a lot of the thinking that we're doing today, I think in that like top of funnel marketing world, all of those things are really like ideas that make total sense to engineers and honestly make less sense to product people. So engineering and performance marketing, I think they just have like a lot in common and can build a lot of respect for each other, and an ability to work together. I think the hardest thing for engineers is the idea that kind of like testing and experimentation involves a lot of throwaway code, and engineers hate throwaway code. So, I think those are the types of things that are like big mindset shifts for people, but ultimately like incredibly, incredibly important. And for Credit Karma, I think drove the majority of our growth for the time I was there.
Yeah. So, so this is interesting because I'm not sure I agree on the part with the experimentation that you have to throw things away, right? So, like, let's say you have a good experimentation setup, and I don't know how you guys are doing it, but like we're shipping about, I don't know, I would say per team about 10 to 15 experiments per quarter.
Okay.
And because of the success rate is just not that good, right? So like 30 to 35% success rate on the initial hypothesis. Um, you kind of get used to throwing code away. Is that not what you meant with that, or is it more, or did you mean it more in the context of marketing in the sense that if you do something for marketing, you have to throw it away anyways because most of their stuff also fails? Or
What a 30 to 35% success rate seems incredibly small to me.
well, we're not
But
as good as you, Matt. That's what it is.
I think that the reality for me is like um, most experiments I think we ran at Credit Karma, a thing worked. So we thought a lot about like multivariate hypotheses.
Mm-hmm.
Most solutions found like some lift in what they were doing. And I guess it depends on like how you define success, but even creating like two or three different versions of a flow means that
Yeah.
one
Okay.
of them is bound to be better, but 2/3 of them are not going to continue to exist. And it wasn't until we got into like, kind of like multi-armed bandit experiments where
Yeah.
you could find different user groups who resonated with different experiences in different ways and continue to keep them active long term and really have like personalization as a core part of our strategy. But at that point, you're shipping like 5 or 7 experiments and keeping 4, and the other ones like aren't worth continuing to run. But the more broadly you're thinking about these problems, you're usually able to find something that does it better. And with that, like if you're looking for a specific thing, it's really hard to find it. But if you're looking for anything, it's really easy to find it. So like I think the mindset that we always have going into those experiments is like we're working on something that we don't think works well. We don't know exactly which thing is going to be the best solution, but we can usually find something better.
Yeah, okay, it's just so to clarify, so we don't look like complete schmucks. When I talk about a 30% success rate, what I mean is that sometimes you have to do reiterations, right? So,
Totally.
like, it takes me like 4 to 5 iterations sometimes on, even on bets where I was just like, this is going to work 100%, and then it just doesn't. But yeah, I mean, of course, reiterations are also going into this. One of the dangers is probably one of the sunk cost fallacy that I also started to notice in that if you're on the fourth iteration of something and you get closer and closer to beating the original, you're kind of like one more, right? So like one more iteration, but at some point you just have to you have to pull the plug. It's just not worth it. And but yeah, you don't know how that is because you're not failing your experiments. So I will come to you and book a course at some point, Matt. I think I think that's really
But
good.
at Credit Karma, there was this really famous mobile website for like our credit cards landing page, and it generated a surprisingly large amount of revenue. And this was probably like 7 or 8 years ago, but it was the desktop site on mobile web. Like you had to pinch and move, and we'd be like, "Wow, this is like generating a meaningful number of dollars," and it is probably the single worst web page I've ever been on. So every like designer or product manager who looked at the data would be like, "Oh, definitely, this is like
Yeah.
performing pretty well. But if I like mobile optimize this, we're gonna like crush it, huge lift." And every single time someone tried for like a 4 year period, it performed not just worse, but like 10, 20, 30% worse on conversion. When you took something that was basically unusable and made it easier. But anytime like a new PM or designer came through that team, they'd be like, "Oh, we should make a mobile version of this page. We should make this better." And every single time they tanked conversion of it. And it was kind of this like hilarious thing that you'd be like, "Well, let me tell you the history and I'll show you." And they're like, "No, no, no, I can make this better.
Yeah.
You don't understand." And I'm like, "I might understand," but it's probably was like our worst case scenario of that, just like multiple iterations, lots of sunk cost fallacy,
Yeah.
and a lot of people who just believe that users would like something easier, and sometimes they don't. I
But
don't know.
don't leave me hanging now. So like, why was that page? So because I'm
No
gonna
idea.
design a hypothesis. Sorry.
I have no idea why.
Yeah. Okay. I can totally relate. We switched the core technology on something, just like the technology on the in the back end on a current version, which objectively leads to better results. It does not perform better. We have not figured out yet why. It's been 6 months.
Yes, sometimes you improve page load speed and you see like a drop
Yeah.
off in experience, and you're just like, I don't understand what just happened here.
Yeah. Exactly. Like keep it slow.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, maybe let's just shift a little bit in that sense. So, like, if you could go back like 10 years, it's just you could also go back 9 years, okay, if you want. But if you could go back just in time a little bit before this entire industry became awesome, I guess. Is there any company that you would have loved to be a fly on the wall or work there just because of how you know it turns out? And let's just ignore equity because nobody wants to work at Google right now in this call.
Mm.
Um, but let's just like, is there any company where you would have loved to be there from the start to just to see how it happened?
It's not a company that I think about, but the first job in my career, we did AI research and a variety of other research projects. And there was a professor at NYU named Jeff Hahn, and he showed me this like really cool screen he had built. Think of it the size of like a big monitor, and he had built a touch screen that allowed you to put multiple touches on the screen at the same time and have all of them register. And I pitched internally that I thought we should do some projects with him and combine it with this idea of zoomable user interface, ZUI. And I'd say like every year or so, a friend of mine who worked at that company texts me probably around my birthday, and it's like, "Remember when you said we should basically like invest in zoomable user interface and multi-touch, like 4 years before the iPhone came out?" It's like, you were totally right. I wish we had done that. And, been on like the forefront of basically how like UI and human factors would work for phone screens. And we didn't, but that's like, I think the project that got away in my mind. Just like, oh, I wonder what would happen if we had worked on that instead.
Do you? Do
Similarly,
you?
we did a ton of AI work in case-based reasoning and not
Yeah.
Bayesian theory. And, like I wish we had done a bunch of Bayes math instead. Picking the wrong stuff. Monte Carlo simulations didn't get where I wanted them to go. But I know a lot about AI technologies that we barely use today.
Yeah. It's quite interesting because of, I think people underestimate how difficult it was back then. Also, because I remember also like when I was working at Microsoft in 2010, I had to look up my own CV now. There were the first touch devices coming out with Microsoft Surface with multi-touch at the same time.
Hmm.
And just like the gesture recognition itself, back then it was actually quite difficult, right? You did not have some GitHub open source project that was just
Yeah.
handling it for you. Like you had to do everything, but it's incredibly complex. I think I appreciate it a lot. Like if I think about my phone, how precise it is and how it can differentiate the fingers even if they're close together and the amount of pressure and everything. There's a lot of thought going into this, and I find it quite amazing, even on a basic level like this. And
Yeah, we were doing some research with a team at Northwestern who was working on just like shape recognition from
yeah,
drawing. And like recognizing a finger or a stylus drawing a square versus a circle back then was like really hard. Like they weren't that different in the human gesture because they're not perfect, right? Like a quick square and a quick circle, kind of the same size. Like maybe you can tell that there's edges, maybe you can't. But like writing the algorithm to do that was really nuanced and difficult. And when someone drew like kind of an oval and it kind of wasn't one smooth swoop, you'd be like, hot dog, not hot dog type of issue. That stuff was different then than it is today.
yeah. I find it fascinating. Nevertheless, I did a business case like a couple of months ago for a robotics company, and they're on the level of Boston Dynamics kind of stuff. And I started to learn how with what kind of problems that robotic nowadays robotics is dealing with. So you not only have like navigating an environment problems, but also the perception side of robots, like stuff that is really simple for us. There's a name for this. Is really difficult for a robot. Like picking up a cup for us is extremely simple, but for a robot, you have to teach what a cup is, especially if it varies a little bit from like the standard cup that you taught it on, and so forth and so forth. And it's extremely, I think sometimes it's very underestimated by customers how much work goes into something like this. So you just have some basic output. And it's absolutely amazing to me what's happening in the industry. And maybe this is also a very good segue into the next thing that I wanted to ask you about some trends that excite me and that excite you.
Mm.
I'm just going to start with this now because I think the developments in AI and machine learning, deep learning, is absolutely fascinating to me. It goes from automated content production. Yesterday I tried out for the first time a content AI that was insane. I'm very much into image processing AIs, which I also find very fascinating, and I think the limit is it's going to be absolutely crazy in that sense. Is there anything in the industry that maybe aside from also AI just took that away from you, but like just in general, maybe also on the not maybe on the product side, but like in general how we develop products? Is there anything where you feel like this is going to revolutionize the market? This is going to change, and you better should be ready also as a company for it. Is there anything that comes to your mind?
Even it's interesting because I still think there are technologies that are like close but not quite there. And you look at things like Miro and FigJam, which I think are marvelous products, and they still aren't as good as standing in front of a whiteboard. And I think we're seeing a lot of that in the context of this like huge transition to remote work, that those tools still need to like up level a meaningful way to really like approximate the equivalence of what it's like to be able to just like dynamically be in a room with a group of people for some period of time. So I think that I'm really interested in continued work in the future of work, and I think we've made some big strides in the last few years, and I think there's some like really big strides still to be made if we want to see the kind of like end of the office and desire for those things. Like we're a remote first company, but anytime I get in front of a group of people again and just like, oh yeah, this is actually way better
Yeah.
than not having it. I think emerging technologies are, kind of abound, but it's hard to pick something that's like still emerging and not yet sort of there. Like I'm not a big believer yet in Web3. I think there's a lot of interesting concepts, but the tooling isn't there, and
Yeah.
you know, hammer looking for a nail type of problem. And
Yep.
I think there's a lot of other interesting stuff out there, but
Yeah.
I think future of work's probably the area that I'm like the most excited to see sort of like move forward in a really meaningful way.
I remember 2 years ago when this entire COVID thing started. Um, I think the industry moved. I think I saw some graphs like we moved about 6 to 10 years just ahead in terms of adoption of remote work. And I remember it's quite interesting. And by the way, I'm also someone that loves to go to the office, right? So just saying, I had the same experience as you. You know, you just stand in front of people and suddenly like things are just different. So interestingly, when we talk about organizations, what I remember also these 2 years back, because we were also forced into lockdown here sometimes, right? So like people had to work from home. It was relatively strict for us. I don't know how it was in San Francisco, but this was the experience that we had to deal with. What happened also was, so LinkedIn is usually a good sort of, because everybody's on LinkedIn. Everybody talks about what happened to their daughters and mothers and fathers in the workplace. And I remember there were a lot of people going with the opinion that this remote thing is not going to work. People will be going back to the office and so forth. But at the same time, I think one of the mistakes that we used to do, and I'm saying this as a proponent of being in the office, is that we try to use the initial meeting structures and organizations that we had, why we had to work remote, and then assume this is just going to work, right? But I think we're figuring it out. So what I'm wondering is as well, like, did something change in terms of, so you said you're remote first, but like, did something change in the way that you also organize team rituals? Are you doing more? Are you doing different ones? Because at the same time we hear like, oh, there's too many meetings, there's too many meetings. Is there something that you feel like that has also changed in this regard?
You were talking earlier about this interest in scaling companies,
Yeah.
and I think one of the things that's interesting about Reforge is there was some stuff with remote first that I thought we were just exceptional at. The problem with scaling companies is they sort of break all your process and methodology as you scale. So like a system that works well for 15 or 25 or even 50 people often like won't work at all for 1,000. So as you have these like growth curves, you have a bunch of inflection points where as you grow, whatever you're doing today inherently gets worse and eventually breaks. So you're either trying to fix it or you're like watching it burn. And then the things that you fix, they break again in 18 to 24 months because you've grown again and whatever process you put in place is like no longer appropriate. And it's kind of like hard to future-proof something. If you build something good for 5,000 people, it actually just doesn't work today. So I think with these processes, like we were an exceptional document-driven culture and we were like really, really good at it. And I think that that's one of the things that's like different about remote is people like to work async and they're happy to read. Whereas once you get in a room, people like don't want to sit and read a doc around each other. And I know like Amazon's good at that, but just like sociologically, I think you want someone to just tell you, just tell me. I don't want to read the thing now. No, just tell me what's in here. And we were this great document driven culture. One of the things I've noticed is that scaled is the more humans you have, the more like human emotion and feeling matters, and documents tend to drive less emotion in the process, and people can be like a little bit more clinical in their review of things. And then you get together in person and you like realize like what the emotion is involved in a situation. You have to kind of like unpack it. So I think for us, we have to like relearn a bunch of the things that we thought worked before. But unlike the office, there are playbooks for each of those things. Like we've had office environments for years, and a lot of those systems and processes, you're just like, oh, well, we do this now, and then we do this next, and we do this next, and you watch it happen twice, and you're just like, okay, I kind of know around this corner we have to do this, around that corner we have to do that, and each one with remote's a little different. So I think there were a lot of companies that have sort of had moments where they're like, oh, we figured it out, and then they break it again, and then they're like, oh, well, we don't actually know what's around this corner or where that inflection point is or like what the problems are. So lots of new learnings for like organizational psychology and dynamics. I'm sure Adam Grant's been really busy.
Yeah. Well, he doesn't have enough followers. In case someone doesn't know him, just follow him on LinkedIn. He needs it. And yeah, no, for sure. And I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of like, we have to relearn. And I think also like as a society, as workers, we have to learn how to work remote. I definitely have a tendency to come across more harsh online than I am in person.
Totally. You aren't
I've heard that
alone. Yeah.
I've heard that many times as a feedback, and like also if someone from the C level writes on a public document, "What is this crap?" Someone from my team will read it, and then there's a problem. What I find interesting is that also like specific. So one of the podcast guests that I will have is Matthew Skelton, and he also published another book after his Team Topologies one, which is pretty fascinating work for me, just to address the remote part of the entire thing. And I think that's where the industry will go and update the books, if you want to call it that way. And yeah, I think you nailed it. I have nothing more smarter to add to this than we have to relearn how to work remote with each other. And yeah, that's pretty exciting, I think, in the end, anyways. But I think that's where it goes. And also, like leadership in a remote environment it's I think it's more delicate because things can go wrong much easier. That is at least my perception at the moment. I think drama comes up much faster.
You actually
Um,
also get fewer inputs.
yeah,
So
you have less data points.
you have less
If you
data
have,
points. So you
yeah,
kind of like don't know if after a meeting someone walks out in a huff because they just like turn off their screen and they're done, or
yeah,
you
yeah,
know, you don't get that moment of like walking into the coffee bar and seeing a bunch of angry people, or like just like the vibe of a team as you walk by them.
yeah,
So a lot of that stuff is so much more invisible, which is why tools like Culture Amp and stuff like that have really, I think, were important before and have really like risen in importance in these
yeah,
companies. But yeah, I think there are a bunch of new dynamics, and like one of the hard things about leadership is you don't get a ton of empathy and like compassion. So people expect you to know stuff and you just don't know it. And so as a group, we have to be like a lot more explicit with each other of just like, hey, I'm upset by this thing that happened.
yeah,
I'm never going to know that if you just like log off the meeting or turn your
yeah,
camera off and I never see you and you never say anything like I would have if we were in person, and I'd be like, hey, you look really upset.
yeah,
Let me like take a moment of caring and check in with you. So there are a lot of these things that I think are definite like learnings that teams have, but for a lot of us as leaders, some of that we're used to because we've had distributed teams before, even when they were all in the office. So like we were spread across
fair enough.
4 offices on my team at Credit Karma,
Hmm.
but usually you would have somebody who was willing to talk to you about something. But like oftentimes the teams don't even know all of the dynamics happening within them.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think I think that's fair, and I also, as you said, right. So like picking up the emotions is quite difficult. But even if people learn how to voice how they feel, I think you still need an approach. And I also think this is why concepts like radical candor is becoming quite popular, whether you agree with it or not. I personally do very much. You just need to establish it as a culture that, hey, if something annoys you, just tell me. I have so little context about each and every one of you individually. It's just very difficult for me to read the room. So you need to tell me. But that is difficult. That is
I
difficult.
think concepts like radical candor are incredibly important. I think it's probably actually just like the best 2x2 ever created. It's like so clear and makes so much sense and works so well on just like a really
Yeah.
simple floor. But I think the hardest part is recognizing as a leader that like authenticity matters. I think one of my like recruiting life hacks is being authentic in interviews. And I think we have this like whole history of trying to put your like interview face on both sides of the equation, companies and interviewees. And then what ends up happening is you have these matches that probably weren't good because neither side was being authentic. And, you know, being a white cisgendered upper middle class male, it's easy for me to say that like if you're authentic, then you'll like get the right outcomes in the end. But the reality is like if a company doesn't want to work with you who you are, that's like not going to change 6 months in when they actually find out who you are. So it's like now a lot of times in interviews I say that Reforged's the best job I've ever had in my career, and people are like, oh wow, why? And I'm like, oh well, I'm actually just like older and wiser, and I wouldn't work at a shitty job anymore. You know, like why would I put myself through that pain? If I didn't like it, I would leave. And I do think that's like one of the biggest shifts in the last few years is a lot more people are like, oh, wait, I don't have to put up with bullshit
Yeah.
anymore. Like, so it just goes into that, like, as a recruiter at the company, I am who I am on an interview. And I actually think it's a great outcome if someone's like, oh, wow, this guy's an asshole. I don't want to work with him.
Well,
Because
okay,
they're going to feel that way 6 months later once they've
yeah,
worked with
okay,
you.
no, fair enough,
Right?
fair enough.
Yeah, so,
Um,
I don't think I'm an asshole, but like, I'm gonna be practice radical candor in my first interview, right? I talked to somebody yesterday, and I was like, "Oh, I thought this went well. Here are the things I liked. Here are the things I didn't like."
no,
And people are like, "Oh, that's weird," and I'm like, "Well, this is what I would do if we were working together. So now you know.
yeah,
And if you
yeah,
if it's weird and you don't like it, great. Don't choose to work here." And
yeah,
that's like actually a good outcome for me. And for an interviewee, it's a great outcome because they can be like, I don't have to go work at a job I'm not going to like for too long. And I think
yeah,
ultimately, if you're an underrepresented individual and you like don't feel the power in that relationship, I get that when you need a job, but you also shouldn't work at a company that's going to treat you like shit. So if you like are just authentic and everyone's like, oh, we're not respectful of you, you want them to show you in the interview, right? Not like 6 months
yeah.
into working there.
You
So
don't want to waste each other's time, and yeah,
you
and
forget each other selfishly. You don't want to waste your time. Like you're
yeah,
better.
of course not.
So like people want to
Yeah,
find, yeah. So I think just like radical candor starts with this like care personally mindset. And I think for individuals, it's like starts with caring about yourself and like that confidence that you can care personally then about others because you're not constantly like worried about where you stand or who you are or how other people are going to respond to you.
no,
And whenever I've sort of like used extrinsic motivations in my career, I've always been way worse at my job than when I had intrinsic motivations. And I found like there's a huge power in self-narrative about who you want to be and who you
no,
are. And if you can tell a story of like, we were talking about, I can't remember if it was in the podcast or just before, but like my style is much more calm than it used to be. And part of that arose when I was like, I would just like tell myself, I'm like, hey, you're like the leaf in the wind. You like go where it's going to go, right? Just like relax. You're the blade of grass, right? And I would talk to myself about those things because I recognized that like there were only so many things I could control. But when I was getting amped up and I was getting like really fixated on the outcome and not the process, I was making a lot of mistakes.
no,
But it wasn't that someone else was like telling me that. It was like I decided for myself how I wanted to be. And I could kind of talk to myself beforehand about how I wanted to appear in that meeting, how I want to respond to things. And then I could look at myself afterwards and I'm like, oh, you messed that meeting up. Not because of the outcome, but because of the inputs. Like you got amped up about that point that was wrong rather than like
yeah,
take it where it wanted to go. And I think that all this stuff just comes with caring personally about yourself before you can care personally about others.
yeah, yeah, 100%. I can relate to this more than you think, and I also think for me it took me until I was 38 to really get what you just said.
Totally.
Now you don't know how long that is ago, but it's a couple of years ago. But I think, no, without a joke, as hippie as it sounds, right? Like you need to love yourself before you can give out any care to anyone else.
Totally.
I do it a little bit different than you in recruiting calls. So basically, sometimes I ask candidates, on a scale from 1 to 10, how much honest feedback do you want? And without a fail, they say 10, right? So, and then they're
Totally.
ready. And people are listening. They are listening, right? And I think the way that I also frame radical candor is not just to be mean or like just to point out the bad things. I want to prove to you in that moment that I listened with the good parts, with the bad parts, because there's usually always both, of course. And people enjoy this so much. I've never had someone take it really personal. Wait, that's not true. Wait, I had someone that took it really personal. But other than that, I think it's exactly what you said. Reveal yourself as soon as you can. Be vulnerable. Show what you can do, what you cannot do, and then, yeah, as we said, shit burns every day. It doesn't matter
Yeah.
how professional you are.
Yeah. You are in there every day dealing with it. So You just
Yeah,
want to be in there with a
exactly.
bunch of people who you want to do it with, right? That's
Yeah,
I think, like often in software engineering, we talk about this idea of the 10x engineer, but I think that it's a little bullshit. And what what I've found is like we think of that as like the John Carmacks and the Linus Torvalds who put their headphones on and they write 10 times the perfect code that everyone else could write. And maybe there's like one in a billion of those folks, But a true 10x engineer is an engineer who can work with 100 people and make them all 10% better. And,
yeah,
a lot of those folks just come with that like understanding of the human dynamic as the first step of shipping software. And when you can do that, you just have like such a larger impact than your peers
yeah,
because most companies aren't filled with Linus's Torvalds, which is why they get huge. And the bigger they get, the more complicated each project is, the more humans it takes to accomplish these like big meaningful things. And the people who actually like understand how to work with all of those humans are completely invaluable in our industry. And a lot of that comes back to just things like, can you care personally about other people?
yeah,
And it sounds hard,
yeah,
but it's not.
yeah, yeah. If we have time for one last question, because I really wanted to ask you this one.
Go for it.
Um, this is something that I noticed, and I would like to also hear whether this is the same that you see for engineers. So there's this very interesting thing happening when you have a startup that becomes successful. And we have a lot of startups coming up right now. They're going to Series A, Series B, they get a lot of funding. Suddenly you start to grow from 10 to 20 to 30, 50 people. Now, what I see in coaching is I get a lot of people who are starting to write me, hey, Leah, I'm the CPO of this organization because we have now a couple of teams. I don't have any product experience. How should I learn this? And one of the problems with being a CPO, and this is how I make the turnaround now to you, it's very difficult to stay at the head of a department like this without having any actual product management experience. But because you're a founder, you still want to stay at the helm, right? So this is very often the case where these people just cross this leadership canyon that Reforge also calls it.
Mm-hmm.
And they just become these leaders with not that much experience. Now, I'm not saying that an engineer that becomes a CTO doesn't know how to code, but they might not have any leadership experience. And what you just said about how to become a 10x engineer, you suddenly have as a CTO many engineers that you have to take care of. You
Mm-hmm.
have to be less operationally involved. So what would you say to someone that comes to you and says, Matt, I'm now the CTO. I don't want to step down. I'm an engineer by heart. I want to lead this entire department. What is the first thing that they have to look at so this entire show does not burn down?
Well, I think it's interesting because actually I think really does start with the individual. Do you really want this job?
Mm-hmm.
And I think people get attached to like titles and the ideas of titles. But if you actually like don't enjoy your everyday work and the work it takes to be successful, then you're not going to bring the motivation you need to get better. So like those people who are still reading the tech journals and not reading the people management journals, they probably don't really want that job. And I think tons of those like Series B and C companies are taking their technical co-founders and leveling them with like VPs of engineering who are going to really run everything, because in the end those people really never wanted that job as much as they like kept it for some period of time, and that's great. But I think one of the things that's differentiated me in my career is that's like what I've always wanted. And I like the people aspect of what I'm doing. I think it's important. So first you have to like want to do the work. If you don't want to do the work, you're going to really struggle.
No.
And then I think one of the things that's interesting, like Credit Karma had 3 VPs of engineering and they were all really different humans. And they approached their job in really different ways. And, like I'm a nerd at heart, played Dungeons and Dragons as a kid. And oftentimes I think about humans as sort of, like an algorithm. With a given input, you're going to get a certain output from them. And they have like attributes and skills that they can bring to the table. Any mixture of those attributes and skills can honestly be successful. There's not only like one way to do it, but the things that you're great at and you spike on, you need to make sure that you can lean into making them happen. They're your superpower. They're like what makes you unique. So one of those leaders was super into accountability structure. Just like really thought about everything in terms of systems. One of them was ridiculously technical, and they like really leaned into that. And I was like very people focused. And each of those things resulted in teams that were incredibly different, but like ultimately effective. So as you look at the tools out there, you're then matching those like tools to your skills. And I don't think of a lot of this stuff as sort of like innate talents so much as just really, really long held skills. So, you know, I was the one who got my friends to the movies on time in high school, you know, convinced everybody to go out to eat at the same restaurant, even though 14 people had like a different thing they all wanted. You know,
Yeah.
like, the same skills I use today to like get my team to agree on an approach to a thing, right? And so if you don't start working on those until you're like a 33-year-old founder, then you have like 25 years less experience doing it than somebody else.
Yeah.
So a lot of times when you're looking at folks coming up within your organization, you're looking for these like social skills that they've developed for long periods of time, and you're figuring out like, how do I take this person's superpower as the thing that makes them special and unique, and like I'm able to re-leverage them, and do they align with the things that I think make like good leaders in a given situation.
No.
Your leadership skills aren't really like your hard skills. Your ability to code doesn't make you a good leader generally. So it's like your other abilities that matter. So you have to first like recognize, what are those things? Do I want this? Do I want to lean into all these other skills?
Yeah.
How developed or underdeveloped are they? And then my playbook won't work for everyone because I have like a different toolkit.
No.
But you need to understand like, what's your toolkit and how do I like best leverage it? Because it tends to be the skills we spike on that sort of like the superpowers that we want to build things around. So if you think of like superheroes, you have somebody like the Flash who runs really fast. And at the beginning of the comics, they run really fast. That's the skill they have.
Yeah.
And then they run across a person who's like really strong, and it doesn't matter how fast you run because you don't know how to hurt them. So then they like figure out how to run really fast and generate static electricity and like shoot a lightning bolt, right? So you're basically taking your superpower and learning how to do offense and defense and all of these other skills with it. So, you know, like as a people-centric leader, I often think about like, well, who am I surrounding myself with, and how am I like helping them be successful to like expand my capability? And I don't have to be good at all the things. So like I can be a little disorganized. I'm really good at like organizing a thing, but I hate running the ship. Like if it's just working, like that's like my worst nightmare. So I'm always like looking for somebody who's like, I'm happy to be like the one running this meeting every week and making this thing happen. But you know, like you're trying to figure out, how do I cover for my weaknesses with my strengths?
Yeah.
And like net increase the overall output and impact I have. And you're like continuing to kind of like adapt and improve. But that playbook for everybody is always like a little bit different, right?
Yeah.
Because you have different superpowers. But those superpowers come from the stuff that you've just like invested all this time and energy in over decades. And so when you're like a 33-year-old founder who's like suddenly finding yourself managing a big team, and you're like, I should suddenly start caring about people, it's like kind of too fucking late.
I suddenly noticed I have to care about people.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. You earlier said, I think it was in the pre-talk, that alignment eats strategy for breakfast. I have a relatively similar saying that nobody's quoting me on, but you can use it for free if you want to. I think that passion beats talent any day. So it doesn't matter whether I would be a talented tennis player or whatever. If I don't enjoy it, there's no chance that I'm becoming good at it. And I think also this applies to also people in the sense that you said. And I'm also a big proponent on focusing on strengths and building from there instead of just like trying to iron out the weaknesses all the time. Like Leah is always swearing, Leah is doing this and Leah is doing that. Let's focus on what Leah is good at, and I think that's where we should go. So I took one learning from this now that I'm going to include in every recruitment talk, and I think it's a very good point to finish. I will ask all my future candidates, how do you convince 13 of your friends to go into the same restaurant with you, instead of just like, how many windows are there in San Francisco and how much are you gonna charge for this to clean? So I think this is a great way to end this podcast. Thank you very much, Matt. I hope you also had fun. And is just as a closing remark from yourself, Is there any point in contacting you over LinkedIn? Do you want this? Do you want people to tell you something about Reforge, about you? If somebody wants to get in contact, how can they make your life better?
Well, I do highly recommend Reforge. I think for me, it's definitely like a passion project. As a people-centric leader, I've always just said, like, I usually tell my team, anyone who's worked for me will have heard this before, but like, as a leader, you get as far as your bench takes you. And which means like your ability to make the people around you better, like just raises the water level of all of the boats. So I look at Reforge as a way to kind of like do that at scale. So if you want to do great product work, there's a like-minded community at Reforge I would love to see more people at. And yeah, happy to have people find me on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter occasionally, mostly tweeting about my kids, at Matt_Muffin. And yeah, happy to see you in the Reforge Slack if you come join our community.
Amazing. I will put it in the description. Thank you so much. And thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks, Leia. I appreciate it.